My name is Zachary Schrimsher. I'm a country boy from Athens, Alabama. I grew up in a Christian home. My dad was a Baptist minister, so we knew the Word of God unlike anybody else, and we know he did too. Um, my testimony is a little different. I'm telling a story today that I've never told. This is the first time it's been recorded. I got really sick about now coming up next month. It's been 7 years, but let me kind of run it back. I got really sick and I went into the hospital. But what happened before that was what made this so strange. I was living in Tuscaloosa. My wife was going to the University of Alabama, and I was actually selling insurance down there at the time. And my dad, being a minister at a church in North Alabama, which is about 2 hours away from where we were, said that there was a lady there that wanted to meet the pastor's son, and she just kept on. And every Sunday, Daddy would call me on the phone and say, "This lady wants to meet you." So we came home. Eventually came home, and I met her in the fellowship hall. So we're in there with everybody's eating. Baptists, I guess we like to eat, so we're in the fellowship hall. And this little lady comes to me, and she can't be 5 foot tall. And she just comes up to me and she wraps her arm around me and she starts talking to me. One of the first things this lady ever said to me is, she said she's been talking to God, and that God told her that something was going to happen to me. And then when it happened, that don't worry, because she's going to be there. Now, this is the first time I met this lady. So I kind of, wanted to pat her on the head and be cordial because I'm the preacher's son, and say, "Hey, little Jesus freak, go on," But sure enough, 4 years later, I got sick and I was in the hospital. The doctors can't explain what happened to me. No one can. No one knows why this happened to me, but I got sick and I started coughing up stuff that looked like pink marshmallow puff. And it was pretty bad. I went into the hospital, and I didn't immediately go in ICU. I went in the hospital and I got progressively worse. And it got to the point to where I was getting no oxygen in my body, and I went into a coma. So the things that happened in there, the things that I saw, I usually don't talk about. It's it's really not things of this world, things you can't explain, colors that we haven't seen, and things like that. But I remember being in a hospital. I remember seeing different things. But this lady, my sister contacted Clara. I think this is the story. I'm not 100% sure because we just don't talk about it. But they contacted Clara and asked her to pray. They contacted Claire and asked her. They called her Claire Bear and asked her to pray, because this lady can pray like no one else. And she did. And then at 4 o'clock in the morning, she wakes up and she goes in the kitchen. She says her husband is sitting in the kitchen. She can see him from the stripes of the blinds from the lamppost outside. And she says, "Buddy, what has you up at this hour?" And he said one word. She said, "Zach." He said, "Zach." And then she told him, "We must go." If you go back and look at the weather that night, it was tornadoes. There was actually, where they were driving to come see me, there's no way, that's impossible they could have found the place. We lived in Trustful, and the hospital that I was in, we could barely find. This is a lady who didn't carry a cell phone, that didn't have a GPS unit, got in their car and started driving, and she said we ended up at the hospital. Now, that's a story that's hard to believe, but compared to what she's about to do next through the power of God, it's all extremely believable. For some reason, I was in the hospital bed when she arrives on the property of the hospital. I could see her step out of her car. I can see her walk to the building. There was a puddle of water that she stepped into, and me being in the room inside the hospital, I could see it. I remember seeing them walk in. Even though it's like I was looking at the building as if it was a blueprint, they were inside the waiting room getting ready to come see me because they had visitation. And I could hear the nurse, and there's no way I could have physically heard. My spirit or something heard this lady say that, or heard the nurse say that only family could come back. And my dad looked at her and said, "She's more family than we are." And all they wanted was prayer. All they wanted was just somebody to pray for me because it's my last days here. She said, "The Lord said, I've done all the praying." She said, "The Lord said all I had to do was touch All I had to do was touch him. I remember the doors opening up. I was in the nice ICU room with the glass doors, and I've been going through some stuff. I've seen things that I don't really talk about. Some things that I saw I'm forbidden to talk about. But she walked through, and it seemed like the room was filled with a blackness that was darker than black. It's almost like when you're riding down the road and a glare hits you, and it's kind of sharp to your pupil. Whatever this room was filled with, it was a blackness, and it was darker. It wasn't something that hurt your eye. It was something that felt like it pulled your pupil toward it. Let me explain what I'm saying when I say your pupil toward it. I saw things in there that looked demonic. You couldn't see no facial features or anything, but when they would smile, you would see their jaw lines come up to here, and they were all teeth. When I'm trying to think about what the scene looked like, all I can think of is maybe the movie Sin City, where everything was black and white. And only color that I saw in there was when I saw these things running across the walls. They wasn't symmetrical. One hand would be bigger than the other, but they looked like they was covered in some kind of black, shiny scales. And they were running on the side of the walls as if gravity was pulling them, and they were running across the walls like this. These things were jumping off, and they were stabbing a man in the stomach with this giant syringe filled with yellow fluid. It looked like it was white, almost like milk, but it was yellow. And they were pumping it into his stomach. And they looked at me, and when they would look at me, their faces were solid black. And they had two beady red eyes. That was the only color. The only color in my vision was their eyes and the syringe that they were stabbing this man in the stomach with. I didn't know that you wouldn't know they had teeth until they smiled, until they laughed, and they would mock you. You knew what these things were. I never want to be back there again. But I know that when Claire walked into the room, the presence of this 74-year-old woman, it was just like, it was gone. It just engulfed it. It took it up. And she walked in the room, and she said, the Lord said all I had to do was touch him. And I was covered up. I had complications where the tube was busted, and I was foaming up at the mouth and stuff. But they just fixed all that, and they had me strapped down. The only thing that was sticking out at the bottom was my feet. And she talks about, oh, those beautiful feet were sticking up out of the bed. But she came in, and I remember I'm in a coma. I'm dying. I can't move, right? I'm just sitting there. She comes in the room, and I remember where everybody was standing. And she grabs my feet, and her hands, I remember them being kind of warm. And she starts to pray. And as this lady starts to pray, I feel a tangible electricity, like somebody hooked me up to a car battery. It was lightning, this lady. And as she was talking to me, I could feel it running through my body. And she started to pray. She started to pray like no one's ever prayed before. But in my mind, in my world, what I was going through, I felt myself like laying in a bed or a casket inside of a gymnasium. And when this lady would pray, I would hear thousands and thousands of voices behind her. And it was just like everything stopped. Everybody, silence came. And I heard a voice. It reminded me of my grandfather. He had a deep, powerful voice. But this voice said, arise, for today Clara had faith. And she touches me. I'm in a coma, and I hear this. What do I do? I mean, what do you do when you're in a coma? Well, she tells it. Well, I'll tell you what happened. She touched me, and she zapped me. And at that moment, I started shaking my head. Back and forth. I wouldn't stop. I started shaking my head. It freaked my wife out, and she runs out of the room. And I'm just sitting there, and the machinery starts going crazy. It's like, and the machinery shuts down. You can check all this stuff. So the machinery shuts down, and that lady starts praying, and I start shaking my head. I start coming back alive. And I remember the lady talking to the doctor saying, I've already given him Ativan. Should I give him more? And I remember them giving me Ativan. And I just remember telling them, I remember trying to wake up that moment. I remember the moment she touched me. I was trying to wake them up and tell them that all this stuff is real. The healing's real. The power's real. The other world, heaven is real. I just wanted to come back and tell. But when you come back, you're just a crazy person. I came back and I told my dad, these things that were running across the wall, stabbing this man in the stomach was my father. My father, he was a minister, but when he found out that I was going to die, he got drunk. He couldn't take it, and he went and got drunk. A year after me being out of the hospital, I remember telling my wife about this image that I saw, because I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't talk about it for a long time after, and I remember her pulling over the car, and she goes, "Did you know anything about what your daddy did that day?" And she tells me about him drinking that day. When I told my dad it was so real, he forbid me to ever tell that story. My dad's is a great godly man. But at that time, he just failed. But back to the hospital, when this lady touched me, she's at me, my wife runs out of the room. Doctor's saying I don't have a chance to live. And Clara went and told my wife, said, "Honey," she's always calling us honey, don't you worry about a thing. He'll be in this room for 3 days. He's going to go in another room for 3 days. And on that 7th day, he'll go home. And that's exactly what happened. That's who I am. So I know what happened to me happened not for me, it happened for the world. I was extremely healthy. The doctors cannot explain what happened. My testimony's not mine. It's for the world to have. It maybe somewhere somebody could hear this and it leads them to Christ, and my life was worth living. My life was worth dying and living again. So I've decided to, and when you first come out, I had survivor's remorse. I wanted to go back to that place. It's a peace that goes beyond understanding. I wish that you can't explain it. And I spent 6 years trying to do it. It's impossible, but that's where I want to be, back there. So I'm a minister. I'm not a Baptist, I'm just a minister of the Word of God. And that's all I do. So if I say I spend 80 to 100 hours a week in my Bible, that's underestimated. I spent days and days and days of my life trying to figure out what happened to me, and I know that it was just something that we call this. It's not natural. It's supernatural. It's if it will, it's just, it's real, and this is who I am.